What if the world's oldest civilization wasn't actually the first? In the deserts of Iraq, archaeologists found something impossible: cities that appeared fully formed, writing that had no ancestors, mathematics so advanced we still use it today, but no one knows where it came from. The Sumerians didn't slowly build civilization, they inherited it. Their myths speak of teachers who came down from heaven. Their temples aligned to stars that moved millennia ago. Their flood stories match dozens of other cultures who never met. And everything, the cities, the writing, the knowledge, appears in history at exactly the same moment, as if someone pressed play on a civilization that was already designed. But designed by whom? And what happened to the original builders? If you've ever felt like human history has missing chapters, like we're living in the sequel to a story no one remembers, then you're ready for what we found. Because buried beneath 5,000 years of accepted history is evidence of something that changes everything. Please hit subscribe. The first clue is waiting. The silence was wrong. Dr. Charles Leonard Woolley had spent enough years digging through the remains of dead civilizations to know what emptiness should sound like. The quiet rustle of sand shifting through broken pottery. The hollow echo when your shovel strikes a buried wall. The whispered collapse of ancient mud brick crumbling back to dust. But standing in the excavation pit at Ur in 1922, surrounded by walls that shouldn't exist, Woolley heard something else. A silence that felt deliberate, as if someone had carefully erased every sound that might explain what he was looking at. 6 feet down, where he expected to find the scattered bones of humanity learning to build, he found perfection instead. Streets laid out in precise grids. Drainage systems engineered with mathematical precision. Walls that ran straight and true for hundreds of yards, their foundations cut deep into bedrock with the confidence of builders who had never known failure. This was supposed to be one of mankind's first attempts at city building, but it looked like someone had been practicing for centuries. Woolley lifted a cuneiform tablet from the dirt, tax records written in neat columns, cataloguing grain shipments and livestock inventories with bureaucratic efficiency that wouldn't be out of place in a modern office. The clay was still warm from the desert sun, but the knowledge pressed into its surface was older than anything human civilization was supposed to possess. He stood there in that trench, holding evidence that made no sense, and felt the first crack appear in everything archaeology had taught him about how societies begin. Because cities don't emerge like this, they stumble into existence over generations, leaving behind the debris of countless mistakes, collapsed walls, failed experiments, the archaeological poetry of trial and error. You should be able to trace their growth like rings in a tree, each layer showing how the builders learned from the previous generation's failures. But here, beneath 4 millennia of sand, lay a blueprint that seemed to have skipped the learning entirely. The pattern repeated itself everywhere they dug. At Uruk, archaeologists had uncovered a metropolis housing nearly 80,000 people, complete with specialized districts for craftsmen, merchants, and priests. Monumental ziggurats rose from the city center like geometric mountains, their stepped sides climbing toward heaven with an architectural confidence that should have taken centuries to develop. Administrative archives recorded complex legal proceedings. Schools taught standardized curricula to young scribes. Workshops produced goods according to specifications so precise they suggested industrial-level quality control. And all of it, every system, every innovation, every leap forward, appeared simultaneously around 3200 BCE, as if someone had drawn up plans for an entire civilization and then built it in a single, coordinated effort. In the lamplight of his tent that evening, Woolley spread out his drawings and tried to make sense of what felt increasingly like a magician's trick. How do you make a civilization appear without showing your work? The mathematics alone defied explanation. The Sumerians hadn't just stumbled onto a working number system, they had created something elegant. Their base 6D mathematics allowed for complex calculations with fractions and large numbers, a system so sophisticated we still use it today when we divide hours into minutes and circles into degrees. This wasn't the kind of practical counting you develop while tallying sheep. This was theoretical mathematics, the product of minds that understood abstract principles our own civilization didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. And then there was the astronomy. Night after night, Sumerian observers had tracked the movements of planets across the sky with an accuracy that seemed impossible without telescopes. They knew Venus was a single object, whether it appeared as morning or evening star. They distinguished Saturn from the surrounding stars despite its barely visible glow. They predicted eclipses and calculated celestial cycles with mathematical precision. Where had they learned to see the sky like that? Who had taught them to recognize patterns in the darkness that took other cultures millennia to discover? At Eridu, the city Sumerians themselves claimed was the first ever built, the mystery deepened into something approaching dread. Beneath the main temple, archaeologists had uncovered 17 construction layers, each built directly atop the last. But these weren't the random additions you'd expect from a building that evolved over time. Each layer followed the exact same architectural plan, the same proportions, the same orientation, the same careful attention to astronomical alignments. 17 times across centuries, builders had climbed these steps, measured these angles, and laid these foundation stones. 17 times they had chosen absolute fidelity over innovation, preservation over progress. It was as if they were terrified of forgetting something. Standing among those ruins today, you can feel the weight of that repetition. The obsessive precision of architects who refused to deviate from a pattern they couldn't or wouldn't explain. What were they so desperate to remember, and what were they so afraid of losing? The conventional story goes like this. Around 3500 BCE, nomadic tribes settled in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates. Agricultural surplus led to population growth, which created the need for social organization, which eventually resulted in civilization. It's clean, logical, and fits comfortably in textbooks. But when you dig past the surface, the evidence begins to resist. Where are the failures, the experimental phase when humans were figuring out how to be civilized? Every other culture leaves behind this archaeological trail of learning. Pottery that gradually improves, tools that slowly evolve, buildings that grow more sophisticated over generations. In Sumer, the earliest layers accessible to archaeologists already show remarkable sophistication. The first cuneiform tablets aren't primitive scratches, they're standardized records written in organized script, complete with mathematical calculations and legal terminology. The earliest irrigation channels aren't simple ditches, they're engineered waterways with locks, gates, and distribution systems. It's as if the Sumerians began their civilization at version 5.0, never bothering with the messy process of learning what version 1.0 should look like. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is what lies beneath Sumer's foundations, or rather, what doesn't. In the deepest layers archaeologists can reach, they don't find the ancestors of Sumerian civilization, they find absence. Not the natural emptiness of uninhabited places, but something that feels deliberately cleaned, swept, prepared. It's like walking into a house where someone has carefully removed all the family photos, leaving behind only the faint outlines on the walls where frames once hung. the Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this emptiness. Their creation myths don't describe civilization's gradual development. They tell stories of a knowledge being delivered, complete and perfect, by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven. The word choice is telling. Not those who always were, or those who emerged from among us, but those who came down. The language suggests arrival, not origin, contact, not creation. According to these ancient texts, the Anunnaki taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, law. Every innovation appears simultaneously in the archaeological record, as if someone had downloaded an entire cultural operating system into human consciousness. Most scholars interpret these myths as symbolic, humanity's tendency to attribute mysterious knowledge to divine intervention. But what if the Sumerians were describing something else? What if they were preserving a memory of learning, not from gods, but from teachers whose origins had been forgotten? The myths describe something the Sumerians called the me, divine laws or cosmic principles that weren't created but recovered, retrieved from chaos, restored to order, rebuilt from memory. That word, rebuilt, echoes through Sumerian literature like a confession. They weren't inventing civilization, they were reconstructing it. But reconstructing it from what? And based on whose memory? Standing in the ruins of as the sun sets over the Iraqi desert, you can feel the weight of these questions, the mathematical precision of the walls, the perfect alignment of the temples, the sense that everything here was built according to plans drawn by architects who are no longer available for questions. And in that silence, that same deliberate silence Woolley first noticed a century ago, you begin to understand what's really missing from our story of human civilization. We're not looking at humanity's first cities, we're looking at its first reconstruction project, which means somewhere buried deeper than we've yet dared to dig lie the blueprints for everything we think we invented ourselves. The original plans for civilization, waiting in the darkness like a door we're not sure we want to open, because if Sumer wasn't the beginning, if it was just the first attempt to rebuild something that came before, then every assumption we've made about human history might be wrong. All of it might be nothing more than the echoes of a memory we've been trying to forget. If that's true, we have to ask, what are we really rebuilding? Who taught us the plans? And why does the thought of finding the original blueprints fill us with a dread we can't quite name? The clay tablet trembled in Professor Samuel Noah Kramer's hands, and for a moment he couldn't tell if it was the tablet or his fingers that were shaking. It was 1956, deep in the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where thousands of cuneiform tablets sat in climate-controlled silence, waiting to surrender their secrets. Kramer had spent 30 years coaxing meaning from these ancient voices, translating the bureaucratic whispers of a dead civilization, tax records, marriage contracts, grain inventories, the mundane poetry of people learning to organize their world with scratches in clay. But this tablet was different, not because of what it said, a routine business agreement between merchants in ancient but because of how impossibly well it said it. Every wedge-shaped mark pressed into the clay with surgical precision, every symbol following grammatical rules so sophisticated they wouldn't be out of place in a modern linguistics textbook. Every line organized in columns that demonstrated not just literacy, but institutional memory codified in clay. The carbon dating placed this tablet at roughly 3,200 BCE, making it one of humanity's earliest attempts at written communication. Except it didn't look like an attempt, it looked like a masterpiece. Kramer set the tablet on his desk with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence of a crime he couldn't quite name. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the confident noise of modern civilization. Down here, in the artificial twilight of the archives, something whispered that humanity's relationship with writing was not what we pretended it to be. How do you invent perfection on the first try? The question had been haunting him for years, growing louder with each tablet he translated, because cuneiform wasn't just functional, it was elegant, not just communicative, but systematic, a fully realized technology for capturing human thought, deployed with the confidence of people who had never seen writing fail. And that confidence was what disturbed him most. Languages are supposed to stumble into existence. They begin as grunts and gestures, evolve into words, gradually develop grammar, slowly learn to represent abstract concepts. Writing systems should show even more evolutionary debris, the archaeological remains of people figuring out how to make marks represent sounds, how to organize symbols into meaning, how to transform the chaotic flow of human speech into something that could survive on clay. But the Sumerian record was surgically clean. Kramer walked to the archive's main catalogue, his footsteps echoing in the underground chamber like whispers in a tomb. Row after row of tablets stretched into the shadows, each one a witness to the same impossible fact. Humanity's oldest writing system showed no signs of being young. He pulled another tablet from its protective housing, a legal document from Lagash that dealt with water rights between neighboring cities. The language was dense with technical terminology, legal precedents, and bureaucratic protocols. The syntax was flawless, the vocabulary precise enough to handle complex negotiations involving multiple parties, standardized measurements, and conditional clauses. This wasn't primitive communication. This was institutional sophistication crystallized in clay, and it bothered him that no one else seemed bothered by this. The conventional story, the one taught in every archaeology classroom, goes like this. Around 3200 BCE, Sumerian merchants needed to track increasingly complex transactions. Necessity mothered invention. Simple pictographs gradually evolved into abstract symbols. Over time, these symbols began representing sounds instead of objects. Eventually, you have writing. It's clean, logical, satisfying. It's also wrong. Because pictographs, when they exist in the archaeological record, don't show gradual evolution into cuneiform. They show up sporadically, inconsistently, with no clear developmental relationship to the sophisticated script that emerges fully formed around 3200 BCE. It's like finding a few random sketches and then claiming they explain the Sistine Chapel. The evolutionary stages are missing, the transitional forms don't exist, the obvious mistakes that should litter any learning process are absent from the record. Just perfection appearing from nowhere like a door opening in a wall you didn't know was there. Kramer returned to his desk and opened his translation notes, pages upon pages of careful analysis that had consumed decades of his life. The more he studied Sumerian grammar, the more convinced he became that these scribes weren't inventing a writing system, they were following one. The language showed structural sophistication that seemed impossible for a first draft. Verb conjugations that handled subtle temporal relationships most languages take millennia to develop. Noun classifications that reveal deep philosophical thinking about the nature of reality. Syntactic rules flexible enough to express everything from mundane accounting to cosmic poetry. And all of it appeared simultaneously, as if someone had downloaded an entire linguistic operating system into human consciousness. He pulled up his translations of the earliest school tablets, exercises from the Edubba, the Sumerian tablet houses, where young scribes learned their craft. But even these educational materials troubled him. Students weren't experimenting with new ways to represent sound and meaning. They were memorizing thousands of lines of predetermined text, mathematical tables, Legal formulas, religious hymns, astronomical observations, education as preservation, not exploration. What were they preserving? And why did preservation feel so urgent? In the growing darkness of the archive, Kramer found himself thinking about silence, the particular quality of quiet that fills spaces where important things have been deliberately removed. It was the same silence he'd noticed in the archaeological record beneath the earliest cuneiform tablets. No practice runs, no experimental symbols, no evidence of a civilization learning to write. Just absence, and then suddenly perfection. The Sumerians had a word for their writing system. Sa, it meant to write, but also to place in order and to remember. The same root appeared in words for preservation, restoration, and reconstruction, as if writing itself was not about creation, but about preventing something from being lost, not invention, salvation. Kramer closed his eyes and tried to imagine the first Sumerian scribe sitting in some long-buried chamber, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. What had that moment felt like? The thrill of discovery? The satisfaction of invention? Or the weight of responsibility, knowing you were the last link in a chain that stretched back to teachers whose names had already been forgotten? Because the more he studied these tablets, the more convinced he became that cuneiform wasn't humanity's first writing system. It was humanity's first backup drive. The myths supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories didn't describe writing being invented. They described it being recovered. The me, those cosmic principles that governed civilization, weren't created by humans. They were retrieved from chaos, restored to order, transmitted by the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation. But sitting in that archive, surrounded by tablets that whispered of knowledge too perfect to have been learned from scratch, Kramer began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't writing creation myths? What if they were writing user manuals? Instructions for preserving knowledge that was already ancient when the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. Guidelines for maintaining systems that had been designed by minds the Sumerians could remember only in fragments and metaphors. He opened another tablet, astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The same scribes who recorded grain shipments were mapping the cosmos using a writing system sophisticated enough to handle both mundane accounting and celestial mechanics. From day one, what kind of culture invents writing and immediately points it toward the stars? The kind that isn't inventing anything, the kind that's trying to remember. The silence in the archive pressed against him like a weight. Thousands of tablets, millions of carefully pressed symbols, centuries of preserved knowledge, all of it feeling like an echo of something larger that had been speaking in a voice we could no longer hear. And then cuneiform simply vanished from history. Not gradually, not through evolution into other scripts, but cleanly, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, as if the backup process was complete. Kramer sat back in his chair and let the question form that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If the Sumerians were preserving rather than creating, what exactly were they trying so desperately not to forget? Because somewhere in the silence before the first tablet, something had been worth preserving. Something important enough to encode in wedge-shaped marks and bury in desert sand for future civilizations to discover. Something we might still be trying to remember, one translated symbol at a time. And if that was true, if the world's oldest writing system was actually a preservation project disguised as an invention, then the real question wasn't how the Sumerians learned to write. It was who taught them what to remember. The night sky above Mesopotamia, in 3000 BCE was darker than anything we can imagine now. No light pollution, no artificial glow washing out the stars. Just infinite blackness punctuated by thousands of points of light, each one a mystery waiting to be solved by minds that had never seen a telescope, never held a compass, never even conceived of the wheel. Dr. Hermann Hunger knew this darkness intimately. He had spent 40 years studying ancient astronomy, translating Babylonian star charts in the climate-controlled silence of Vienna's Academy of Sciences. But on this particular evening in 1998, as he held a photograph of a tablet that would change everything he thought he knew about human civilization, Hunger felt the same vertigo that must have gripped those ancient skywatchers as they realized they were staring into infinity. The tablet was catalogued as VAT 4956, a Babylonian copy of much older Sumerian observations. But what made